Welcome to Capital Consumption Theory. I'm Eddie Chu, and I'm here with Brian Winters and Zach Widmer today. And today we're going to talk about monetary policy transmission mechanisms. So this is from the Federal Reserve website, and it is a short article about monetary policy. What are its goals, and how does it work? And I wanted to show one quote here, which is I think is interesting. It says when it's talking about how does monetary policy work, and it says when overall demand slows relative to the economy's capacity to produce goods and services, unemployment tends to rise and inflation tends to decline. So I just thought this was interesting because it includes the phrase the economy's capacity to produce goods and services. And if you follow along with capital consumption theory a bit, we're very big on looking at the capacity utilization in the economy and thinking about what that means. So the Federal Reserve, at least in this writing, does sort of acknowledge the economy's capacity. And this is the economy's capacity is something also that MMT brings up and seems to sort of like it seems to be central to MMT. But the funny thing about the Federal Reserve and MMT is that even though they mention it, and in some ways it is very fundamental to um, the framework, generally speaking, after they mention it at the very beginning and then later on, like, you never hear them talk about capacity at all. It's very rare for them to talk about things like capacity utilization. Whereas if you look at capacity utilization, it does very interesting things, such
Hey, Eddie, can
as.
you go back to that sentence you highlighted? If you go back to that again, can you just kind of like walk us through that quickly, and why,
Right.
when overall demand slows relative to the economy's capacity to produce goods and services,
Yeah.
unemployment tends to rise and inflation tends to decline? Why is that?
Right.
Right,
And
because we're
Eddie,
not
I
meeting
think
our economic capacity right now.
Yeah.
there's a good part at the top of this article that says that the core functions of monetary policy are to manage three things, and I think that though that relationship is an important thing to kind of
Right.
talk about.
Yeah. So monetary policy, if we go back in history 100 years to the Great Depression,
Oh
um,
boy.
the current framework begins really with the Great Depression and with Keynes. And Keynes, at the time, overthrows the previous thinking, because prior to Keynes, the classical economists, they were sort of like laissez-faire. They were sort of like, the government should do as little as possible in intervening in the economy, and just let the economy be, and the economy will kind of fix everything that needs fixing by itself. So, for example, the classical idea is that economic downturns are sort of self-correcting. That you may have a downturn, but as demand for goods and services goes down, um, the classical view is that businesses, seeing demand go down, will actually be incentivized to lower their prices. And so when they lower their prices, then the money in the economy becomes worth more in terms of good services.
So,
That makes everyone richer, and so that's supposed to spur demand again so that you can get out of the downturn.
and
So
so why is it a reduction in demand relative to the total economic capacity? Right? So if the capacity increases but demand stays the same,
yeah,
then what are the consequences of that?
that is a very interesting detour. So let's go ahead and just take off on that detour.
Well,
Because
because
that's
this
really what
that
we're focused
highlighted sentence was setting up the condition that said that the outcome should be um,
relative to the economy's capacity to produce goods and services, right?
Right. And so it
Yeah.
says in that scenario that unemployment would go up and inflation would slow.
Yeah. So we can set up a thought experiment here and say, what if demand sort of stayed kind of stable? We were still demanding the same numbers of goods and services, but somehow the capacity went way up. Would that cause unemployment? Um, and I would argue that it would. So first of all, we have to figure out in our thought experiment, why is capacity going up? So capacity, the economy's capacity to produce goods and services, fundamentally, I would say, are based on labor in the economy and capital in the economy. Those are the two primary factors, the most important ones that determine how many goods and services you can produce. I think labor is sort of self-explanatory, but capital is important. So, I've sometimes talked about capital before with the analogy of, or not, well, not exactly the analogy, the example of, 200 years ago, 90% of the economy was agricultural goods. And, it took 90% of everybody's labor just to grow enough food for everyone to eat. That was most of the economy. And fast forward 200 years later, it's now more like 3% of the economy. The productivity in agricultural goods has gone up about 30 times, and so you need only like one. You need only a very small percent. Like you only need 3% of people now to be working in agriculture to produce the same amount of goods, or probably even more. Um, and the reason they can do that is that we are using mechanized farming. So, if you go to a farm, they have all that, the mechanized equipment with the tractors and the long machine arms. And so they farm enormous amounts of land um, relative to how much labor they're putting in because they're able to use these huge machines, and that increases productivity. So that is capital. So capital, at its very the core to me the core characteristic of capital is that productivity benefit. um, Another example is like the automated weaving machines that came in the 1800s, and the whole Luddite movement was based on hand weavers getting upset that these big machines that had enormous productivity, enormous output, those were sort of outcompeting them, taking away their
Well,
job.
that's not in that's part of it, but I forget what book I was just reading recently. It was talking about it, how there used to be under British law protection
Yeah,
for the workers, and then Parliament like repealed all of it, and
right.
that was sort of also a triggering mechanism for the Luddite
Yeah,
movement.
I think that was definitely a triggering mechanism, but I think the economics underlying the situation, like if you don't have the automated weaving machines, then you don't have a problem. Then the weavers are doing what they've done for hundreds of years and they're happy. But then you bring the machines in, and they're going to threaten to completely out, like it's no longer, it really makes the old way of doing things obsolete and inefficient relative to what you can do with the machines. So, a lot of times, there may have been protections in the beginning, but as time passed on, then the protections went away, and so the problem which had already arrived, became, just sort of became more obvious. But there's definitely no problem before the machines. Once the machines comes, there's definitely potentially a problem, and there's you've got to do something about it. The market response would just to cause the price of these things to go way down, and the old the hand weaving that to become very unprofitable, and that livelihood to be sort of destroyed. Anyways, the point is, if we are imagining a thought experiment where the capacity goes way up, um, even though demand is not going down, but capacity goes way up, and does that cause unemployment? So I'd say, definitely that does. One of the most important, insights of capital consumption theory is that capital and labor So the labor that you're doing and the capital, which can potentially sort of replace that labor, these two are imperfect substitutes, but they are substitutes. You can, as you put in more capital, then you reduce the mix of labor in your production process, right? So what happens is that if capacity goes up, even the demand is stable and it's not even going down. But what's going to happen is that you're going to have unutilized capacity. And that unutilized capacity is both underutilization of the capital and it's underutilization of the labor. So that's where we go, with capital consumption theory, where you see that, from the 70s to the present, returns on capital, the interest rate is going down, and the wages are, they're not necessarily going down, but they're stagnant. They are not growing the way the economy is growing.
I'm on board so far.
Yeah. All right. So what are our
So
goals?
it's a bit like, so if you imagine that we are like a giant household, the economy, the country, it's a giant household. And we previously like did things and we made the things that we wanted and we consumed the things that we wanted. Everything was fine. And then people come along and they start inventing these machines that can do work for us. Okay, that seems like a wonderful thing. And what happens is that our capacity for production goes up, right? One of the things that would happen in the household is that temporarily, we were used to like spending all of our labor to get the things that we want. And then suddenly the machines take over part of that. And suddenly in the household, we're like, gee, we don't have anything to do. Right? So in a household, this would be wonderful. You would go to the beach, you would do like whatever the heck you wanted to, and you'd say, that's great. Now I have more free time. Um, but in the economy it's different because we're not a household. We don't sort of share that way. Instead of building the machines and saying, now that we've got this production, even though people don't have to work as much, everybody can just be sort of free some of the time and just do whatever they want. The economy is set up that people have to make their money through their labor. The worker consumer has to make their money through their labor. And so what you end up with is, um, something that Alan Watts described a little bit, that I described that I call the automated, um, um, the Alan Watts factory analogy, where this businessman builds this wonderful automated factory. He lays off his workers, and then he turns around and finds that nobody has any money to buy the products of his factory because they've all been laid off and they don't have money to spend. So that is sort of analogies. But when we bring it back to the economy, this has been going on for 200 something years. Productivity growth has, ever since the Industrial Revolution. And in 200 years, people are still working. So there are different reasons that happens. One reason is that in the economy, when the labor demand goes down, you don't immediately get unemployment. You only get stagnation because what you have is you just have productivity pressing down on the labor wage, and the labor wage, it can stagnate. It can stay low and become sort of cheaper relative to the entire economy. So when the labor wage is getting cheaper relative to the economy, then businesses are finding, you know, well, we don't need labor that much, but if the price is going to stay stagnant and stay cheap, then if it's cheap enough, then we'll figure out something for these people to do. So you don't initially get unemployment; you just get wages that stagnate and get cheaper relative to the economy. That's one of the things. So one of the things that the reason that even though as you have this enormous productivity growth over 200 years, you don't get like what many people imagine, what the Luddites imagined, and what many people even today imagine would happen with big automation is that they imagine that like, half the population will just be thrown out of work. And that actually doesn't happen. It didn't happen in the past. And it's really probably not going to happen now.
Aren't
Um,
we aren't we at like term lows when it comes to employment participation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, and participation, yeah, is also at long-term lows. But it's certainly not like the dystopian, this thing where like two-thirds of society is just has no job to do. We're not there, and I would argue that we would never get there. One of the reasons being that wages adjust downwards to prevent that happening. Um, and then another reason, which is sort of more important, is that there is a there is a there's a mechanism to put these people back to work. So if we go back to the household analogy, um, where we've built these machines, now we have nothing to do. One of the things that can happen is that the people in the household decide, well, now that we have, this free time, let's go bake a cake. Cakes are delicious. Let's go bake some more cakes, or let's do some artwork or something. You can find things to do. So the parallel thing that happens in the whole economy is that you have product innovation, you have goods and services innovation. And so as the productivity growth is pushing down on labor demand, and this labor demand resource, this input resource, is becoming sort of slack and a little bit underutilized, and becoming quite cheap. um, One of the things is that entrepreneurs will come up with something new to sell. So if they like invent the iPhone, and suddenly like the entire world needs an iPhone, then you've now done the equivalent of deciding to bake a cake. You found something that people want, the economy wants, and that new thing, that new product or service, can put the labor back to work. Does that make sense? So the whole picture.
Innovation, yeah. So the one
Innovation.
thing that I would add on to your kind of thing, you kind of put on capital and something else, but I feel like you need to have a part of it be innovation, because innovation needs to be a separate thing that needs to be tracked, because capital is a force multiplier to innovation and labor
Right.
instead of
So
being capital and labor.
Right. So here's the whole picture with all of those things. So you have the capital and the labor supporting production, and you have capital accumulation. You're accumulating more and more capital, building more factories, and technology is improving. So capital is increasing, productivity is increasing, and that so that actually pushes down on the demand for labor. It makes labor more slack. On the other hand, you have another force, which is product innovation. It's not production innovation, that doesn't count, but product innovation, where you're coming up with new things that people want. So if you imagine, like 200 years ago, we just
Nobody
grew
thought of a
food,
unicorn frappuccino back then.
and then we ate it, yeah, and that was life. Like
And now we
that was
want
it. That's
pink
90% of
pink
life. 90%
milkshakes.
of the economy. You grow food and you eat it. 200 years later, that's only 3% of the economy, and there's just like Zach is saying, there's just to unimaginable different things that the economy produces that people may want, even including like virtual weapons on a video game that's a multiplayer game,
Don't get
that
me started on pay to win
virtual.
video games, Eddie. You don't want to
all of
hear that.
this all of this crazy stuff has been added to the economy, and it's things that somebody is willing to pay for, and that puts the economy back to work. So you have two forces. You have productivity growth pushing down on sort of demand relative to capacity, and then on the other hand, you have product innovation, pushing up on demand relative to capacity. And what capital consumption theory says happens is that because the paradox of the worker consumer, because the spending in the economy and the labor income in the economy, because those two things form a loop where people are spending money, businesses then have to pay workers to do the work, and then workers who are also consumers, then they have money to spend again. Because of this loop, you end up with a sort of a quasi-stable situation where if the spending is sort of going up and up, what happens is that the spending going up causes the labor income to go up, which causes spending to go up again. And what you end up with is a stable trend where you're getting more and more capacity utilization. Demand is going up relative to capacity, and so you have that trend upwards, and that's what you see from the 1930s Great Depression, when capacity is at around 70%, falls into the 60%. And then as you recover from it, then you get into the virtuous side of that cycle, and it goes up and up and up, and then it keeps going up, the spending and the labor income, until you get to the 70s. And by the time you get to the 70s, um, you're bumping up against the constraints of capacity. So the spending is still trying to go up, but because the capacity is limited and is not as growing as fast as the spending is growing, then you start to have, full factories, full capacity, and businesses cannot increase their production as much as their customers want. And so they end up with incentive that if they can't produce more, then the way to make more money is to raise their prices. So you end up with inflation, capacity constrained inflation in the 70s, because that is where you're at in the capital consumption cycle, with too much consumption chasing too little capital, with the capital being sort of the one of the major productive forces, and the major productive force that actually changes, because labor per capita doesn't really change very much, in the entire 200 years. The whole time everybody has 24 hours in a day, and they have to sleep at least 6 to 8 hours a night, et cetera, et cetera.
That's super interesting. I really like the way you put it, Eddie. I don't have much to add other than I really want to see a little like cartoon of this with like
Yeah,
innovation like increasing and it goes into these things. And I really like the way you put it, like where it makes this do this. And
yeah.
that's all I want to see.
I want to see that too, but I'm not I can't draw worth anything. So, if anybody's watching and is great at creating like cartoons or drawing or animations, I would
Eddie's
love.
hire You heard it here. Eddie's hiring an animator for
It's a
he
big
has
volunteer effort. I don't have a heck of a lot of money to invest in it,
You
but
could probably find
that's
somebody on Fiverr who'd draw it for you or
pretty, and
whatever.
would like to animate it. That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Um,
So sounds good, Eddie. This all kind of makes sense. One thing though about the monetary policy and specifically the dual mandate.
yeah,
So if we want to see America transform and be, get rid of that scarcity mindset and have a mindset of abundance, then we're going to have to stop measuring maximum employment, I think, and instead change it to minimizing poverty.
exactly.
Instead,
Um,
on that.
Right. The way I would put it is that, um, and if you guys are interested in CMT, I think CMT has sort of a similar vein. Is that the um, unemployment measure? It's irrelevant. It is not an effective indicator. Brian, you and I in a previous episode where we were talking about inflation and unemployment, we looked at the unemployment measure. And you can see that, for the entire chart, from the inflationary 70s to the present day, where you have, sort of rising poverty and rising wealth inequality and a lot of suffering, the unemployment measure, it just bounces around that level of, say 3% to 8% ish. Um, the one, the only time that unemployment goes really high is at the very bottom of the capital consumption theory. That is where we are today, and it's where we were in the Great Depression. And the reason that unemployment goes up, and in the Great Depression went up to 25%, is that at some point you hit a sort of a floor, which is what the left calls starvation wages. So at some point, the wages get so low relative to the economy and the prices in the economy, such as housing, or healthcare or other stuff, that you raise there's a floor. There's a floor on that pricing, where eventually get to the point where either the businesses or the employees or both say, like, no, it just cannot go further down. Like, we like, it may be that businesses would just be embarrassed to offer a wage of like $3 an hour. And there's also the minimum wage, but that keeps getting lower in real terms. But at some point it gets ridiculous. and
What about
and
unpaid internships? I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
well,
some things, yeah, flow through. I mean, you also have unpaid internships, but it's like that. If in economics, when you have a market price, the idea is generally that it's supposed to stabilize. A market, price model of labor would say that you would never have unemployment, because if there were not enough labor demand, then the price would just go down. And then as the price goes down, then you do get enough demand at the lower price. So that does make sense, that normally there's just no unemployment, no matter how high wages are, or no matter how low wages are. Um, those are always sort of in balance. And the only reason why you would have a separation where there's too much supply and not enough demand, is if there is a floor on the price. There's something that prevents the price from going down further. And so my idea is that is starvation wages. There's a wage that's too low, that even though market forces would push it in that direction, but businesses or the employees say, sorry, that that's just, that's not going to work. And then you start getting unemployment. So that's what happens in the 30s. That's what happens. Um, that's what's trending a little bit, in the current era. Um, but the point is that unemployment is a terrible measure. What you should be measuring is capacity utilization, because capacity utilization tells you, what as a society we could be having versus what we are having. So if you go back 200 years, there's no way for, 200 years ago, for the economy to provide, $100,000 worth of goods per person. It just does not have that capacity. But, right now we do have that capacity, and it's underutilized. Capacity utilization is at, um, around 70%. It's probably up to 73-ish right now. And so on the one hand, that is the right measure, because it is what we could actually have in reality. Um, and on the other hand, it's also important because of our thought experiment, which Brian just brought up, which is that, um, even if we are producing quite a bit in terms of, and there's quite a bit of demand, there's almost 20 trillion worth right now, and that's a lot. But if capacity is even higher, then what happens is that you get that, um, you get those low wages, and you get the low interest rates, and you get the financial bubbles, and you get a lot of unhealthy, distorted things. So that is what we should actually be looking at. And another thing that we should be looking at, which is related to that, is we should be looking at, um, capital consumption, capital versus consumption, which is also another way to look at it, is wealth inequality. So if you have all this concentration of capital at the top, um, the problem with that is that all of the capital, the productive capital, the stuff that produces goods, which the wealthy people own, um, you have all of that, but then the people on the bottom, the worker consumer, are not able to consume it. Um, so that's where you get all of the distortions and the all of the problems.
I have some thoughts on that, but I think we are about over time by 5 minutes.
Right. Yeah, yeah, I can feel myself going on a bit of a
Sorry,
bit of
I threw a new topic at you there
yeah,
in the
Yeah,
code.
it's Brian's fault.
Yeah, blame it on me.
yeah. Monetary policy, right. So let's go over a bit and try to talk about the original topic a little bit now that we've fleshed out capital consumption theory. So this is the background of our viewpoint. Um, so when Keynes overthrows classical economics, back in the 30s during the Great Depression, um, his his one of his very influential ideas is the paradox of thrift, where if you imagine everybody in the economy and they're in a downturn, everybody's scared, so they're not spending, and so spending goes down, so everybody's income goes down, and so GDP just goes down. Everybody's trying to save, but instead, what happens is that the GDP and the income just goes down. That's the paradox of thrift. And so monetary policy is set up with that in mind, and fiscal policy also. And the orthodox idea, most people's idea, is viewing the economy as this monolith, and not distinguishing the differences between, say, wealthy and poor, or wealthy and everybody else. And they just see it as a monolith. And so if you're getting paradox of thrift and the GDP is going down or whatever, you're having a downturn, then you put monetary policy in, you put fiscal stimulus in, and that's supposed to sort of get everything going again. The problem with that, from the point of capital consumption theory, is that you have to separate, you have to realize that the capitalists and the worker consumers are different, um, and that it is not actually in a recession. It may be a paradox of thrift dynamic, but in a depression like the Great Depression, and like sort of like some like present era where the Fed is struggling mightily to keep us out of a depressionary situation. Um, what is happening is not the paradox of thrift. What's happening is that you have, again, too much capital and not enough consumption, to utilize that capital. You have the reason that spending is getting stuck a little bit is because the worker consumer, um, even as you get more and more income at the top with the capitalists, the worker consumer is sort of starving for income. So it's a structural thing. It's not psychological. It's structural, where the worker consumer doesn't have enough income, and so they cannot generate enough spending. And the capitalists cannot also cannot generate enough spending because, um, they're such a small part of the population. Maybe they're like 1%, that even though they buy everything that they want because they have plenty of money, but even like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, they may have an income this year of $5 billion, but they're not going to spend $5 billion. They probably they don't spend anything near that, and all of it just goes to more capital. But the capital, again, is not cannot be utilized. So the mistake with monetary policy and fiscal policy in orthodox economics is that, they're just thinking in terms of putting more in or taking more out. And so, with the how monetary policy works, this is, that's sort of how that they think about it. And
Yeah,
so,
I was listening to a podcast with actually the I think it's Joe Biden's economic policy guy, and he said we no longer are thinking about distributions. We're not being what did he say? We're not being agnostic to distributions.
yeah,
And that was, I paused it after hearing that, and I was like, you were thinking of like every monetary policy before this, you were thinking agnostically to distributions. No wonder we are where we are today. Holy crap, that's a terrible idea.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, so that's encouraging. Who is this guy? Who is Joe Biden?
I wish I will look up and see if I can find it. He was talking, I think, on the Ezra Klein podcast, so I'll just go back and check that.
Yeah, Joe Biden's rhetoric has been a little bit encouraging. Us Yang gang, we probably think, he listened to Andrew Yang, and he may well have. I think he did. But his rhetoric is a little bit encouraging. He's talking about building the economy from the bottom up instead of building it from the top down, and that is exactly what we've been doing wrong. Is that we've gotten into a situation where it's top down, and that includes monetary policy, which goes to the corporations through the corporate loans, and to some degree, fiscal policy, and I think has also been a little bit imbalanced, and like you can see things like PPP, and it goes to businesses, not consumers, and not only that, it even seems to go more to like the larger businesses, because those are the guys that the banks, are kind of are more paying more attention to. They take care of their biggest customers first, and so the PPP goes to large businesses.
And it's
Uh,
something interesting too to think about on the ground level of what people think about money and just how the economy works.
yeah,
I read once that we were talking about kind of the conservative thinking is karma. People who do the right thing get rewarded.
yeah,
Um, and so people who make money deserve more money. And I heard one person say that anytime the government spends money on poor people, that's just money that's been wrongly spent. And it's so interesting to think, actually, economically, you're completely wrong. Morally, you have some kind of leg to stand on, but morally doesn't, or your economics don't care about your morality. It's an interesting thought experiment for me.
yeah, yeah.
All right. Anything else you want to cover tonight, Eddie?
Um, let's see. So we really did not get into monetary policy, transmission mechanisms. So we're probably going to, let's do that on a follow up episode. So yeah, if you're listening, look forward to that, and hope you enjoyed the tangent that we had today, which was, I think it was a good inlay, again, into explaining sort of what capital consumption theory consists of, where it's coming from, and what the insights and the evidence are, that we're talking about here.
I think it's good, Eddie. I think, we have to like put our definitions before we go into things. And so it's good to kind of talk about what monetary policy is and what it's trying to do before then we can actually talk about like
Yeah.
how.
Yeah, I think we're actually going to a bi-weekly schedule with these discussions. And then on every other week, I will be working on putting doing like some lecture videos to sort of go through, do the whole thing, build it up from the start to the finish. Um, so hopefully that'll turn out well, and hopefully people will enjoy that. So I guess that's the end of our episode today. Thanks everyone. See you guys later.